Welcome everyone to a very special episode on the Bevvy channel, something a bit different from our usual format. We're delighted to be joined by Frank Turnbull from Griffins, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the Cask 88 story. So very excited to get stuck into this. I think it might get a bit complex, so we're joined by a drama Lefroy to keep us steady, keep us through it. But Frank, Steve, thank you very much for joining us. For those who are completely new to sort of the legal world, what is Griffins? What's your day-to-day?
Thanks, Laurie. Well, Griffins is a firm of insolvency practitioners. We specialise in financial forensic analysis, investigations, conventional insolvency and restructuring as well. Frequently, a lot of our clients tend to come from the investor sort of side of matters. They might find themselves creditors on investment portfolios where they're worried about how their investment's been treated, whether or not there's been some sort of financial mismanagement in the business. And we tend to focus on matters which have a little bit more sort of the question of some kind of misfeasance or possible fraud, although it doesn't always apply. One of the things we frequently find is that what people think may have happened and what has actually happened frequently diverge. So part of our job is to go in, understand the situation, understand what it is that people believe may have happened, establish whether that's true or not, and then try and sort of bring some sort of resolution or recovery to the proceedings.
Interesting. So as we mentioned, you've been involved with the Cask 88 situation in 2025. Cask 88 is probably the brand that most of our viewers are familiar with, but they're just part of a bigger, is it like a parent company? You mentioned Whisky Merchants Trading off camera. How are all these different brands and companies linked?
Right, so let's take this back a few steps. We were approached, and it's probably worth doing this in chronology so that it helps everyone understand. So we were approached on around sort of the 16th of April, 2025 by one of the directors of Whisky Merchants Trading and Cask 88, a chap called Ed Davidson, that people will doubtless know as being a sort of very public face of this. And what they'd identified was that with Cask 88 and Braeburn Whisky, Cask 88 and Braeburn largely trading out of Singapore, and then Whisky Merchants Trading being based in Scotland, they'd identified some financial irregularities that gave them cause for concern. So they needed to understand whether or not there was a systemic problem here which needed to be resolved, whether that caused an issue for investor confidence. And as part of our discussions with Ed over time, we were looking at the financial operation of Cask 88 and Braeburn, the business models for investors. I mean, it's worth saying, of course, there's two forms of investment here, one of which is the investment into whiskey to own, to drink, to enjoy at some point further down the line, and the other one is the more speculative investment, which is into whiskey as a commodity. You know, do you expect it to increase in value? There's a prevailing view that whiskey will always be a rising market, which I mean, we can come on to my thoughts on that later. So there was a concern, and we were going over these points with Ed. And one of the options available after we'd had these initial discussions was to simply say, well, the best thing to do here is effectively bring a pause to any kind of proceedings, any concerns, any legal proceedings, any potential distress that might be levied against the company by creditors such as HMRC, put administrators in place. And the administrators can then find the best resolution available to this particular problem. And they will identify if there's been any mismanagement or fraud on the part of any member of staff, or whether there's been any sort of negligence which might have arisen, and then find a solution. Frequently what you see in administration has three purposes, one of which is going to be to rescue the company. One of which will be to generate a better return for creditors, and the other one of which will simply be to realise property for a secured creditor. Now here, I think because of the investments exposure, there was a strong driver to try and find a rescue which enabled anyone who owned a cask to have some protection over their position, to ensure that their investment was secure. And if there was any question over title or ownership of the whiskey itself, that could then also be resolved. And it's worth bearing in mind that this company was set up in, also, I would say 16th of April 2018, I think. It was April 2018. So it had traded, it had built up a brand and a reputation. It had built up a wide following around the world. It had sort of diversified. It had sort of investors really do come from around the world, about 4,500 or so investors. All of them have come on board over time. And of course, the one thing we can't ignore is that 2020, 2021, 2022, the wheels sort of come off a lot of trading operations. So there is always the it was COVID as a defense. Now, that doesn't apply to everything equally, but it does mean that in every scenario, you're looking at it going, was this a viable trading business which was properly meeting all its costs they felt due? Was it satisfying investor needs? Was it transferring money as required? And then the pandemic happened. How did it carry on from that? Now, one of the reasons why whiskey merchant trading existed was that a lot of the investments came in via Singaporean entities, and there needed to be a domestic UK entity to deal with the payment of bills and costs, the warehousing costs, and to deal with the delivery orders in the Scottish jurisdiction. So you need to have a Scottish company that's here, that's paying the bills, that's controlling the paperwork, that acts as a sort of a fulcrum for dealing with the investments, whilst at the same time the entities that sit outside, where they're promoting to the investors, where they're actively engaging with their base and trying to bring in more interest, they're out there promoting, and that sits separately. Okay. So when we were approached and we were looking at all this, well, we can deal with whiskey merchants trading. We understand what the implications are here. But we also, at the same time, need to coordinate with Singapore. And we ended up working with a company called Menta, who put the entities in Singapore into liquidation. And what we ended up with, it was effectively leading on the strategy in the UK to engineer a rescue for all of the investors into Cask 88 and Braeburn, and at the same time all of the costs incurred by whiskey merchant trading, to try and wrap them all up into a rescue package, which is where the Edinburgh Cask Management Resolution Limited, which has been sort of arranged by one of the co-directors of whiskey merchant trading, Patrick Costello, that's where that comes in. So in a nutshell, it started out as something where it might have suffered from some financial mismanagement. And what we've managed to do is create a sort of a rescue scenario to try and protect the investors, whilst at the same time looking at whether there are other things that happened within it which we need to consider in more detail. Sort of what happened to the funds, what happened to the investment funds, etc. Okay,
so as two brands, Cask 88 and Braeburn, how would they distinguish? Were they just separate brands?
I would distinguish it by saying that Cask 88 was the one that was targeted more at people who wanted to properly own their whiskey, who had an appreciation. I found this. I don't know. This came up recently. The word amateur. Right, comes from, amare is Latin, to love, so anyone who's a rank amateur is basically someone who really loves what they do. And I think that Cask 88 was almost certainly targeted at the people who were more inclined to love the whiskey, more inclined to really pay a particular interest in the whiskey, really wanted to like the idea of ownership. And then Braeburn was the one that was a little bit more targeted at people who saw it as a commodity that could be traded, that could be invested in, that would rise in value. I mean, obviously, there would be people who would diversify across both. And I think that also means that there would be there might have been a distinction between what whiskey was being sold, how things were being dealt with. At the
certainly people that I sort of know in industry that have moved on to be sort of independent bottlers or work for whiskey brands, a lot of them worked at Cask 88 at one point just because they loved whiskey.
Oh, that's
and they had enthusiasm for distilleries and they loved the romance of it all. But in terms of former Braeburn employees, as you say, it's a bit more kind of hard-nosed, a bit more, this is whiskey, this is an investment, this is a financial thing.
My first exposure to this was a friend of mine, Edinburgh friend, who his family had invested in 3 casks. And one of them got opened at his wedding. Another one is one that he's routinely sort of bottled off and then sort of shared around and so on. He sort of gave me the details. I mean, I don't know whether I should be promoting other companies on this, but probably not. But he effectively said it's been fantastic. The family's had 3 different casks. One's a Bruichladdich, one's a Tullibardine.
Tullibardine.
I don't quite have the pronunciation on that. And then the other one is just an Islay blend.
Unnamed Islay.
And it's been fantastic so far, and he's felt very, very confident, very secure. But then that's a slightly different relationship, isn't it? It's more the Cask 88 thing where you're saying, okay, we know we've got a cask, and we can taste it and we can see it, and it is there. Whereas a lot of the concerns that people have had, particularly because of the rise in whiskey investor fraud, there's been more sort of promotion of, you can invest in a cask, it will provide unrealistic returns. That BBC programme looking at the whiskey bandits, for instance.
Because that came out around a similar sort of
time. That was slightly earlier. I think that came out around March. So that was sort of very hot on. We were very hot on the heels of that, and I think everyone was very aware that it could be another whiskey bandit type of scenario. But the thing about whiskey merchants trading Cask 88 and Braeburn, it's got a longer pedigree. The what I saw from the BBC article was that there'd been a rise in these companies that were promoting investments, which had happened over the course of the previous 5 years. Might have been sort of set up largely during the pandemic. pandemic period where people are sitting at home, not able to do anything. And of course, they're keeping themselves entertained in whatever way they can. And one of those is going to be speculative investments. And if they're speculating, that's the point where algorithms come to play as well, and they might be targeted by any other entity, and so it can be engineered in such a way that they are more likely to invest in it, and they will be, and those are the people who are at risk. It used to be in scenarios like this that there might be lists of people that would be circulated, sold on by criminal elements. They used to generate what were called boiler room frauds.
Okay.
So previously, as a firm, we'd had exposure to boiler room frauds where it had been targeting wine investments. So the wine is held in a bonded warehouse, and then you discover that 5 different people all owned the same bottle of wine because it had just simply been sold on to lots of different entities. So there was a risk that whiskey would fall into the same category where you had one cask that's been sold multiple times, or you had a cask that simply didn't exist, and that had then been sold on, or, and this was a real takeaway from that particular program, was a markup factor of 10.
Yes.
So you would find yourself paying well over the odds to something, unrealistically, and then commission would be taken off that as well. So you'd always be presented by sort of a loss-making enterprise, having been promised one that was going to generate you a substantial return.
Yeah, I think it's a very vulnerable category, whiskey, because on paper it's such an easy sell. It's like, well, of course, a 20-year-old whiskey is more valuable than a 10-year-old whiskey.
Yes.
And then you take into account the whole angel share thing, the evaporation, well, there's going to be less and less of it. And I think people who, particularly in Scotland, we're obviously so proud of whiskey, and everybody wants that involvement, everybody loves this romantic notion of owning their own cask of whiskey. So I don't think it's probably come as a surprise that there's been so many, maybe not bandits, but people seeing the appeal of that and thinking we can make a quick buck here.
I would genuinely like to know how many of the companies that are out there promoting this sort of investment are actually legitimate companies versus the ones which aren't. And of course, there's a whole load of safeguards you can always look to. It comes down to how reputable the company might be, who's behind it, how long have they been in the industry, can you actually speak to them, can you turn up at an office in Scotland and have a conversation with someone who can speak knowledgeably and authoritatively. I mean, one of the takeaways from any investigation in here is how many times the people who are promoting the investment scheme really don't know anything about the subject other than the patter they've learned. They learn a script and then they can simply deploy the script.
Yeah, I had a laugh looking at these websites misspelling distillery names and saying, Lafroig is a great Speyside distillery. And no, it's no idea.
Mind you, that said, I was in a very notable central Edinburgh bar last week, and I watched as one of the bar staff decided to promote Lafroig by saying, it's Scottish to an American tourist. It was quite impressive. This might not make the final edit. I don't know.
But I think it feels like there's been a lot of people caught up in the whiskey cask investment thing who aren't, perhaps don't have not that a whiskey pedigree is essential, but I feel like even a basic understanding of how whiskey works, and even the knowledge that not all single cask whiskey ends up being of a quality that it can be sold as a single cask. Most of it goes into blends. Most of it is, isn't of a sufficient standard. It can be bottled.
Well, it's a starting point, isn't it? Why get into whiskey investment? Why get into cask investment as opposed to bottle investment? Why go down the route of having something where you have no effective control, no ownership, you can't have it there, and instead you're into something where the control is handled by someone else. There are ongoing costs for the retention and management. Yes, you'll get something different at the end of it, but there's a greater level of risk, and I think for that you have to have a very strong sense of why you're doing it and what the risk you're taking. And I think this is where it sort of spills into, say, the Braeburn side, where you're looking a little bit more at the promotion of whiskey as a commodity which could be invested in, and where you might expect to see unreasonable or unrealistic returns over time. Why go down that particular route rather than go for something which you might view to be a little bit safer? What is it about whiskey that is so interesting? And are you happy with the idea that you might just risk it all on that form of investment, where, as opposed to the Cask 88 side, which is actually you really do want it's whiskey that you're after. It's whether you drink it or sell it further down the line doesn't really matter, but you're passionately invested in that.
The kind of worst case scenario with an alternative investment is like if the value drops to zero, at least you've got a nice painting or a classic car or a cask of whiskey. But the issue is if the cask doesn't exist in the first place, then you are literally left with nothing.
But this is one of those areas which I think we come across quite frequently is how do you value what you have? How do you who do you trust to say this is the market value of the cask that you have, particularly over time, over management, sort of without contamination, etc. Always perform this always comes up in insolvency. This always comes up in any scenario where people are trying to assess the value of something. You could be sat in a hotel where you might have a range of 1,000 whiskies, all of which the bottles are opened, where the retail value of that is going to be hundreds of thousands of pounds. You do a break-up and sale, and you'll be selling the stock behind the bar for, £5,000, I suppose, £500,000. And there's that shift between one position and the other position, which is very challenging, I think, for anyone dealing with an insolvency, like an administration, or a more conventional winding up. So fortunately, in this case, turning it back around to whiskey merchant trading, I think that anyone who invested the rescue proposal that's out there at the moment is designed to secure the ongoing cask management of anyone who had invested, and where they have the delivery orders. And then for anyone where the delivery order was sort of in transit, where it had been paid for, but the purchase hadn't concluded, then those will be resolved. And then for anywhere there's a question over the delivery order being progressed, and there might have been there's an argument there's negligence has happened, then there'll be a resolution as to that, which might just simply be a sort of capital repayment. And it's a loss on the investments, only in the sense that any future profit isn't sort of passed down the line. But these are all a bit speculative, because it's early days. I mean, it's a fairly recent case still. Given it only went, the administration order was the 2nd of May, so we're a couple of months into it, and there's been a lot of work going on. There's still a lot of questions being asked, and the shame is that there's a lot of investors out there who don't know who to believe as well. So the internet forums, I sort of hate to go down into Reddit, but Reddit are there. Reddit immediately say, this has all gone horribly wrong, everyone's a criminal. Actually, that's not a foregone conclusion. Actually, this is a scenario where people have worked very, very hard to come up with a company which works, and the brand which could be promoted, and which sort of meets the needs of the investors, and then something's gone wrong. And precisely what's happened and the ins and outs of who did what when is something that will come out over time.
So there's no sort of typical, say if I was a cask owner of Cask 88, there's every case is different. Is that kind of my understanding?
I think every case is different. They fall into batches. So there are some where we could say delivery orders exist. Then ownership is certain. Bills have been paid. There's no question over a lien being exercised. And then there will be others whereby they have a document that might say they own the cask. And there is a delivery order waiting to be provided, and it's just that final movement. There might be a final movement to money which just hadn't quite taken place, and there's some that fall into that category. I mean, it's been really interesting seeing how the money, sort of the figures which are talked about. So I went back to my initial notes from the initial meetings, and at that point it was, there's about 45 million under the effective control of, say, Whisky Merchants Trading as the main management company in Scotland, and within that there's a certain percentage of say 10% where there's a question, and we just need to resolve payments. It's understanding the makeup of that 10%, but then that means that there's 90% where there's not an issue, and it's just a matter of making sure there's ongoing payments are being met. So it's never as bad. Well, it doesn't have to be as bad as people might first think, but the first thing the internet will do, of course, is just exaggerate, extrapolate, and sort of, point fingers in every single direction before someone's had the opportunity to go through methodically, forensically, and simply say, well, this is what happens.
People want a dramatic.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everyone loves to create a drama out of the whole thing. I mean, it's sort of, also when it's a topic like whiskey, it's so emotive. It really gets people sort of up and going. I mean, sort of the idea of a distillery going under or a new distillery being created, it's
even people buying a cask as an investment. We'll get a load of people commenting, well, whiskey should be drunk, and why are people holding on to it anyway? So it can be, boiled down some very basic.
I think holding on to whiskey is something I've never been particularly good at. So it just tends to evaporate for some reason. Don't know why.
So you mentioned Edinburgh Cask Management. So that is part of the rescue operation.
Yes.
So tell us where have they come from? How are cask owners being reassured that Edinburgh Cask Management are doing everything by the book?
So this is part of a solution that was engineered with Patrick Costello, who's one of the co-directors of Whisky Merchants Trading, who has has more of an Edinburgh base. I think that's sort of more of a sort of a personal investment in making sure this is actually resolved, because he sees the impacts of investors losing out on their investment there. It's been engineered with the help of our agent, Andy Merricks of Licensed Support Services. Now, he works with insolvency practitioners, administrators, etc., to try and sort of come up with solutions in situations like this. And external funding has come in, which helps effectively deal with any ongoing costs. So it's a bit of a sort of capital injection. And then as part of that, they're also resolving any unpaid orders that might enable the delivery order to be provided. There's a rationalization of the ownership scheme, thorough assessment of who owns what, and then resolution of the remaining issues to either say, right, we can resolve this so you do end up with the whiskey cask you thought you had, or otherwise we'll resolve it in such a way that you stand to recover any investment you might have put in.
Sure.
So the idea is that it's there to protect. The most important thing is wanting to protect markets' confidence as well. I mean, so effectively there are people here who stand the risk of losing, but if everyone panics, then it creates a bigger problem.
Like we were saying off camera, nowadays, if you see even an advert on Facebook for whiskey cask investment, everybody just assumes it's a scam.
Yes.
And there's, some very legitimate traders out there. There's people who love whiskey, who are really passionate about allowing people to share in that experience. There are a few dodgy characters which are hopefully getting sort of sidelined. But that confidence in the category is important to restore that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's the challenge, is finding the reputable, the parties you can deal with a certain sort of knowledge. I mean, I have to say, despite loving whiskey, I mean, I can sort of remember my first one canoeing up in Loch Tay. I can remember my first bottle I bought, which was a Balvenie Doublewood. I can remember sort of different things along different stages. I was very lucky to do a long trip around Scotland a couple of years ago, sort of 3,000-mile road trip, just end up in Islay and back down again. And on Islay, going into the Bruichladdich distillery and getting sort of very close to the idea of saying, actually, wouldn't it be nice to have this? Wouldn't this be nice? And same thing, it was the same year that the Lagavulin had released their Offerman.
Yes.
So we ended up buying a few bottles of that, laying them down for the kids in the future, which was quite nice. And then we went to the Carden Heads. Down in Campden. And getting a view on all the different ways in which whiskey moves on from it just being about the distillery, but it's about artists sort of creating their own expressions of what you can do with the whiskey. It's like really fascinating to see. And I can see why people invest in it, because if you get into this, if you go around, if you spend weeks sort of tasting and speaking to people, you get their enthusiasm, why wouldn't you want a slice of that? I mean, that's a wonderful thing to actually be able to invest into. If that's
whiskies with a story are always fantastic. And if you've got your own story about a particular cask,
Yes, it makes it better. So I can entirely see why people would do it. And I think that when we started looking at whiskey merchant trading, when we were trying to come up with this solution that would enable creditors to be made whole, enable investors to sort of retain confidence, would give them something and effectively reassure them that they weren't the victims of the sort of scams that turn up on the BBC programme. It's being sensitive to that level of interest. I mean, yes, some of the investors, it's truly about the money, it's about the profit. But for a lot of them, it's because it's this particular product, this particular area, and they don't want their experience of Scotland, their experience of whiskey itself to be tainted by the knowledge they've had about investment. You want to keep that sort of that interest, that love. Goes back to the thing about being an amateur, sort of being an enthusiastic amateur. You want to carry on retaining that sort of positive sense of the whiskey itself and your ability to enjoy it without it being tainted by this one experience. So I think we're all quite confident that this is that of all the outcomes available, this is the best possible outcome.
It feels like the whole whiskey investment space needs a bit of a shaking up. And it feels like that's what
I mean,
Griffins are doing.
That is an interesting point, though, about the what do you do to protect against this? Because we talk about the soft skills of, make sure you speak to the people and so on. But when it comes down to how you retain this, how you retain information about ownership, how you retain sort of the delivery orders, I mean, spreadsheet after spreadsheet after spreadsheet of just, here's a name, here's an address, here's an email address that might have been misentered, there's an address that might go out of date, there's a telephone number that might be entered in incorrectly, there's information shared around. And an idea that came out, I was discussing this last week, blockchain. This is one of those areas where actually blockchain is ideal for it, because then you say effectively this particular cask has this particular blockchain, and then you full history transfer through. So that brings it kicking and screaming into the 21st century and says, look, here's a really good way of doing secure investments on whiskey casks. You tie it into the blockchain. How quickly that would happen, I don't know. Or you centralize the register. You centralize it so it's actually easily accessible in the same way that a car or a boat or anything else of any kind of heritable value
you almost want like a standardized, centralized thing, whether it's like, ISBN numbers for books or something for casks. Something that everybody using the same system, I feel is crucial. So for those who are perhaps now looking to get into whiskey cask ownership and are maybe got a little bit of the fear, maybe a bit uncertain about who to trust, what sort of advice would you give?
I would say don't do it remotely.
Okay.
Simply don't engage with this at a distance from your computer without going and tasting and meeting people and talking to people. I appreciate that throws in the idea of a long holiday in Scotland as opposed to simply being able to do it from the other side of the world. But you need to be able to go and speak to people about it. You need to be able to understand. You need to thoroughly research who you're going to go to. If you're going to go to a broker, try and make sure they have a geographical base that's going to be somewhere in the Highlands. Try and tie that to the whiskey that you like and where you are. Speak to other people, get personal recommendations. If you want to go down the line of trying to understand who you're working with, then you can always, start doing your own little background research and into the people involved. But generally, it's possible to see through the sort of the surface level scams, and you want to get a sense there's a real operation which has a bit of heritage to it, where the people involved have a background, they have a pedigree. There's so many ways of finding that out at the moment anyway, but I think there's nothing better than actually just getting out there on the ground and saying, right, what do I like? What do I taste? Right, who do I speak to? Who do the distillery recommend? If you have a particular sort of fondness for Islay and you go to, you drop into the Carlisle distillery and say to them, right, okay, well, I'm sort of really interested. Who do you recommend? Who would you recommend? If I want to invest in a cask, maybe yours, maybe someone else's, who would you recommend?
That's true, I think from my experience, whiskey is such an amazing community. And obviously everybody's, works for their own companies and trying to promote themselves, but ultimately they just want whiskey to be well regarded. And we want everyone to be safe and enjoy it and do their own journey. So everybody's going to help each other out for something like that.
And it's not a static industry, is it? Because there's more distilleries opening up still in Scotland. I know that there was a big move to revamp the Port Charlotte distillery over in Islay, I think, and there were more opening up there.
Yeah, Port Ellen and Brewer.
Port Ellen, that was it. It's growing. It's still growing. There's still an interest. I mean, we don't need to talk about whether whiskey in England or Wales really counts, or sort of the Japanese whiskey market. But specifically, a focus on Scotland. It's a growing industry in Scotland still because there's so much interest in it. And consequently, things like this which attack it or attack its integrity, it's very important to sort of just field them off and simply say, right, the people who are criminals, the police will go after them. Journalists will do excellent work in trying to do that. But if we can find ways of sort of shoring it up and ensuring that people are comfortable with their investment, confident in their investments, then it means that everyone can just sort of be a little bit sort of calmer and a bit more relaxed and just sort of carry on enjoying it. It's quite key.
So to wrap things up, the whole situation with Cask 88, Whiskey Merchants Trading, in your view, it's not simply a case of fraud or negligence. Definitely. It's kind of just a bit of a mess.
It's a bit of a blend. I think that there were some points where there was some financial mismanagement. It became a little bit uneven. I think that there was probably an impact there from COVID. There will have been points where directors maybe took their eye off the ball a little bit. Okay. I mean, it was a global entity. And the problem about global entities is you might have people doing bits of work in different jurisdictions, and communications can sometimes fall down. And if that becomes a problem, that's where that's where the wheels really do come off. Is if you're not accurate, sort of properly communicating with people. And I think that, it's not, I can't say it's over immediately, because the thing about administrations is they run on until any investigations have concluded, until contracts have been satisfied and anyone who needs to be repaid has been repaid. But it will run on for a few years' time, and there will be publicly available reports. For anyone watching this, you can go to Companies House. The reports in respect of what's happened are all there. You can look into the background. You can get in touch with the people who are involved, and you can ask questions. If you're an investor who's lost, if you're a supplier, if you're anyone who's dealing with the warehousing of the cask, that's very easy to get in touch with either my office, or to get in touch with Andy Merrick's office at LSS, or to get in touch with the guys at Edinburgh Cask Management as well. and just specifically say what's going on, because we're not arm's length standoffish on this. We're actually totally invested in making sure the whole thing works.
Yeah,
So,
that's really good. Yeah, I think it's been kind of an unfortunate
Yeah,
period in
absolutely.
whiskey, but it's, as we said, it's probably a good thing that everything's being assessed. Obviously, Edinburgh Cask management seems to be doing some great work in standardising everything. Obviously, Griffins are doing fabulous work as well. So thank you for everything you've done, and
Thank you
to
for an
a
opportunity
speedy
to.
resolution.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laurie.
Cheers.
Cheers.
If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more Bevvy content. We want to hear what you think, your best whiskey experiences, the whiskies you want us to try. It's a really exciting journey we're on, so make sure to join us. Download the Bevvy app on Google Play and App Store to keep track of your whiskey journey, connect with your whiskey friends, keep track of your favourites, anything you could ever want to do with whiskey, all in one place. It's the definitive whiskey companion.